Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, once again. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the high-level roundtable on integrated plans and policies for realizing the 2030 Agenda and its Samoa pathway. I would like to introduce our panelists for this session. Ms. Nicola Virgil Rowe, Director of Economic Development and the Planning Office of the Prime Minister, the Bahamas. His Excellency, Mr. Oliver Joseph, Minister of Economic Development, Planning, Trade, and Labor, Grenada. Honorable Hazel Brandy Williams, Minister of Social and Sustainable Development, Nevis. His Excellency, Ms. Alicia Faturi, Permanent Representative Samoa to the United Nations. Ms. Gretchen Pheromone, Executive Director, United Nations Office for Project Services. Dr. Makusha Kitui, Secretary General, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. We are now moving into the interactive discussions, but I think that we do not have the benefit of the time. So I would like to say, if we have time, I would like to open the floor, but we are seriously behind schedule. I will see what we can do about this. We are here to discuss how CITES can best advance the implementation of Agenda 2030, the Samoa Pathway, and other international agreements while pursuing their sustainable development priorities. The 2030 Agenda encourages each country to undertake various steps to implement the SDGs. These include, first, setting its own national targets, guided by the global level of ambition, while taking into account national circumstances. Two, incorporating the targets in national planning process, policy and strategies. And three, conducting regular and inclusive reviews of progress at the national and subnational levels. We would like to hear about your experiences in undertaking these various steps, where you stand, what has gone well, what you have learned, and your current top challenges. Many countries have started to incorporate SDGs into national development plans and policies, but it is not easy. SDGs cut across sectors and institutions. CITES should not only incorporate the SDGs, but also other international agreements, notably the Shanghai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction and the Paris Climate Change Agreement, into their development plans and the policies. This needs to be done within the context of CITES national priorities. We should therefore place a particular emphasis on the issue of integration. The importance of integrated policies and plans has been recognized since the first Rio Conference on Environment and Development in 1992. Integration means developing policies that build on interlinkages and interconnections across economic, social, and environmental dimensions, and between various SDGs. Plans and policies should be risk-informed and risk-resilient. That is, they take into account risks associated with economic and social shocks, as well as national disasters and the potential potential critical associated with loss and costs. Implementing the SDG requires a whole of government efforts, and indeed a whole of society effort that engage civil society and the private sector. We would also like to hear about your experience in this area. I would now like to give the floor to our distinguished panelists and these speakers, who will address the various dimensions of implementation and integration. The time allocated for each speaker is 10 minutes, and we have timer to help us to keep the track. After the speaker's presentation, we will then open the floor. If possible, if we still have time, then we will ask you to say a few words. Our first speaker is Ms. Nicola Virgil-Raw, Director of Economic Development Planning, Office of the Prime Minister of Bahamas. Ms. Virgil-Raw, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished panelists, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's certainly a pleasure for me to talk about a topic that has occupied about 2 years of my life, one that I'm very passionate about in terms of how my country, the Bahamas, localizes the Sustainable Development Goals into national development. I have the honor of being the first person to use the clicker, so let's hope this goes well. In the interest of time, I had a short video presentation, and I will just ask that that be played at the end if I have time left. The Bahamas is in the process of deep, meaningful transformation, moving from a sleepy fishing village town to a bustling new economy, buoyed by tourism and financial services. We have had, of course, if you've heard, much economic success and some social successes as well, with 2 pillars of tourism and financial services that have and resulted in a high quality of life for our citizens. But of course, there have been some worrisome trends around poverty, around youth unemployment, the ability to generate enough growth in our economy to stimulate jobs and get us through very difficult times. And of course, there are the important issues of natural disasters, which was addressed by the Prime Minister. Because of all of those things, the Bahamas realized that we had to really think about long-term strategic planning. And so in partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank, in 2014, we began the process of developing a national development plan, Vision 2040. It was quite clear to us. We came up with 15 goals for the National Development Plan around a variety of issues about open government, around strengthening of your public institutions, law, and having a law-abiding society, around strengthening our justice systems, around issues of social policy, education, healthcare, poverty and discrimination, around the environment, and around, of course, the economy, diversification, looking at strengthening our fundamentals, and of course, looking at how do we have a fair and flexible labor regime. And it was clear that these matched very well onto the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals. And so we began the process really of looking at our 4 pillars: governance, human capital, environment, and the economy, and matching those against the Sustainable Development Goals. And we spent a lot of time understanding the SDGs. We took the recommendations from our National Development Plan. We have a draft now in effect, and indexed those recommendations against the Sustainable Development Goals. And we also did it the opposite way around as well. We took the SDGs and then also looked at an implementation path for them through the National Development Plan. So we referenced where we had referred to matters related to the Sustainable Development Goals in our National Development Plan. And so in our National Development Plan, we saw obviously an important path towards implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. A key area, SDG 1 in poverty, and an issue that in the Bahamas we really hadn't spoken about as much as we should have. 43,000 persons living at or below the poverty, our current population of 355,000 persons. We looked at the important issues of targeting our specific groups, very vulnerable groups: single mothers, women, persons with criminal backgrounds, recent immigrants. Those types of things were important to look at. We looked at widening the coverage around social protection, and of course, looking at ways to improve data collection. SDG 60 deals with peace and justice and strengthening institutions. And we had 4 goals around this in the National Development Plan under the governance pillar. We looked at ways to strengthen our justice system, looking at public service reform, strengthening defense, and ensuring that there was rule of law that applied to everyone. And of course, the important issue, which is really one of the key aspects of how we implement the Sustainable Development Goals, is ensuring strong public institutions undergirded by transparency and accountability. Okay. SDG 13 looks at climate action. And here we had a series of goals as well, mainly goal 11 of the National Development Plan that really began to put into place building up resilience to disasters and to climate change, focusing on preparedness and response. We looked at both our land, our terrestrial environment, and our marine environment as well. Now we came up with, as I said, 15 national development goals around a myriad of issues. We had 75 strategies and 499 actions. It was a very action-oriented document, and it was important for us to prioritize as a country. And we came up with 6 key areas as we move towards 2030 and 2040. Effective governments, productive people, citizen security, community revitalization, economic development, and having a healthy environment. And so as we think about where we are now at the planning stage and moving towards implementation in terms of projects and ultimately moving towards results for our citizens, these are very critical issues that we have to think through. And we are beginning to see some of those results. We have, for example, the transition of the College of the Bahamas towards the University of the Bahamas, and this will play a crucial role in terms of strengthening data collection and research in our country. We are moving towards universal health care through a national health insurance program, which is now in its beginning phase. We're looking at social protection and poverty through a new RISE program, which deals with conditional cash transfers. To shore up our ability to fund sustainable development, we have introduced a new value-added tax system to really look at fiscal reform. And of course, to deal with food security, we have a new institute in the island of Andros, the BAMSI Institute, which looks at agricultural and marine science. Now, as an archipelago, as was mentioned by the Prime Minister, there is a variety of states of development. And we noted in our work that it was very important for us not to exclude anyone in our country. We have islands that stretch from the tip of Florida to Cuba. And it was important for us to look throughout. So we have in our national development plans specific recommendations around each of the islands. we did an important work around Andros Island, which is our largest island in the country. It's an island which is as big as the island of Trinidad and Tobago, Trinidad, but has 10,000 individuals. And there we focused with partnerships, again, with the Inter-American Development Bank and Stanford University's Natural Capital Project to look at family island development and planning, which focused around environment, people, and financial development as well. And so we came up with an ecosystem services master plan for the island of Andros as our first pilot as we think through this for all of the family islands. And then, of course, it was important for us not to leave out the capital, the island of New Providence, where 70% of our populations live, where the majority of our GDP is generated. And so we had to think through, again, through a partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank, the way to make a more sustainable, secure, and smart Nassau, involving a variety of issues from housing, from community revitalization to dealing with the informal sector of our country so that we can have a great place for us and all Nassauvians and people on New Providence to live and work. And so in terms of lessons learned, going through this process over the last 2 years, I think it's important that for all of us, and the Bahamas was one of the more recent countries to have and work through a national development plan, but the importance of really assessing the realities. And so we spent a year of the process doing a very deep diagnostic of where we are as a country, where we were as a country, looking at the core issues and speaking to people, going through to the islands to understand the particular challenges of the various communities. We then used this input along with research and best practices to design our national recommendations. And I think that was important to do that for ourselves, to understand the recommendations that we would propose. And then we mapped those on to the Sustainable Development Goals, which allowed us to understand where there were important and relevant gaps that we could use the Sustainable Development Goals as this important guide and as a really great source of wisdom. We learned as well that it's very important to ensure that the political discussions, those that are going on in our international bodies, are very much aligned with the realities of home. So that interplay between what's happening at the UN and with the technical bodies at home and capitals is very important. So that close communication between the parties who are abroad and who are at capital is very important for ensuring that the goals are reached. And then finally, I would say that it is important to set up an organizational structure to ensure ownership of the SDGs. Development happens, of course, throughout government agencies' development work, and the goals are related to so many different ministries, but that coordination will be critical for actually achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And so having a proper structure in place, and that's something we are working on now in the country, to ensure that there is ownership and ensure that there is a driving force so that the Sustainable Development Goals and indeed national development plans are actually implemented. Having the monitoring and evaluation frameworks in place, having that continuous feedback so that it's you can see how you move towards achieving those goals are going to be critical. And also we require assistance in that as well. And so this is just a little bit of what we have been doing with the National Development Plan and our attempt to really localize the Sustainable Development Goal. We welcome the opportunity, hopefully in 2018, where we would have an opportunity to participate in the voluntary reviews so that we can actually assess, and we see that as an important driver also in our implementation, certainly from the technical standpoint, to ensure that we continue to meet those targets. With that, I thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very good report on the success stories and also lessons learned. She mentioned the voluntary national review at the United Nations every July in the high-level political forum. I just report to you, last year we have 22 countries volunteered, both developing and developed. This year, the number jumped to 44, twice as much. We have to shut the door because there are other countries, they are knocking at the door, want to become the voluntary country for this year because we cannot accommodate with the limited time available. You just see the enthusiasm from the member states to share their experience, to learn from each other, to have a peer review is so strong. Thank you very much, Madame Vigil Roll. Our second distinguished speaker is His Excellency Mr. Oliver Joseph, Minister of Economic Development Planning and Trade and Labor, Grenada. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a great opportunity to be here to share with you on what Grenada is doing with respect to the SDG number 1, that is end poverty in all its form everywhere. For us in Grenada, this is a critical objective since there are different forms of poverty. So we look at the multidimensional approach and started out by calling all stakeholders together. There's a committee of social partners in which the labor movement, NGOs, the churches, the trade unions are all involved because you need buy-in from society if these goals are to be successful. The government cannot set goals and just hand it down. We must involve all our stakeholders. So that's the first thing I want to put on the table for all countries, to note from our experience, if you involve all stakeholders very early in the game and not after you develop the policy, very early, you involve all stakeholders so that you can get buy-in in the process, then you will get success. So colleagues, this is an opportunity to examine our national context and define our poverty. It is our responsibility to our people to examine all the dimensions in which our people are experiencing poverty and make urgent but significant sustained steps to reduce poverty through planning and policies. These policies and these measures must be sustained. And we are looking at outcomes. We use a results-based matrix so that we can measure the outcome. That is the next important point I wish to put on the table, that you need to measure, monitor, and evaluate and measure your success as you go along. So we are now in the process of developing our National Sustainable Development Plan 2030. It's the same time like the development goals. And we are consulting with all the stakeholders, and in a few months' time, we will launch the plan. And we choose to call it the National Sustainable Development Plan in keeping with the goals of the SDGs 2030. In doing that, we need to look at our legislation to determine what type of changes we need to make in law to ensure that we succeed. We entered a structural adjustment program with the assistance of the IMF. And there are a number of legislation that we introduced. It's a 3-year program, 2014 to 2017. And we introduced legislation to ensure that we have fiscal discipline. We passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act that sets targets that we must meet. And every time a review is done, the IMF will look at the targets that we set and the actions that we have taken to meet it. Given that experience, I wish to suggest for consideration of seeds countries a similar approach in dealing with the sustainable development goals. What we have all the targets. Why not put it down in a matrix with a time frame and then examine at the end of every year where we are? Similar to the letter of intent that we prepared and submitted with all its targets. But every time we meet the target with the fund, international IMF, we get resources. The first year we got $108 million in resources. Second year, 100 million coming from the IMF, the World Bank, the European Union, the Caribbean Development Bank. So we'd like to see the UN system put in place some sort of incentives so that when we meet the target, we can be rewarded. Because that's how you do performance and you reward. The UN, in implementing SDGs, must agree with member states that if they successfully achieve certain targets, they can get technical or financial assistance. That is our experience, as I said, with the fund. And we have managed in 3 years to correct the fiscal situation in the country. We have reduced debt. We have saw growth, 3 years of growth in GDP. We have seen increase in revenue, economic performance. Let us use that same model. And that is what I'm doing as a minister responsible for implementing the goals, SDGs in Grenada. I have said to the staff, we will prepare a matrix similar to what we did with the IMF and submit it to the UN, the United Nations, and put it out there to challenge them to say, work with us, provide technical assistance, because we will need technical assistance, and provide financing. Because policies by itself would not achieve the objective. External financing and adequate policy and planning are mutually dependent. They are not mutually exclusive. They are mutually dependent. They go hand in hand. We are a highly indebted country, and we cannot take loans. And because we are middle income, we cannot get concessionary financing. So what do? A lot of pledges have been made to assist countries, but we find it extremely difficult to access this funding. So we need help to access the funding, to make the funding easier for countries like SEEDS to access. I'm sure everyone around the table is wary of hearing how much billions of dollars that have been pledged. And yet we want 100 million and we can't get it. It is important that we need to approach it in a very practical way. All these documents and all these goals and targets and everything, you could read about that in every area. You go on the website and read about these things. But in a real way, how do countries get to implement this plan? So, as I said, in our case, we have gone through every ministry because cross-cutting issues, and we have looked at all the plans. In the Ministry of Education, they set the objective to promote equitable access to quality and relevant education to all citizens of Grenada, regardless of sex, age, race, color, creed, ability, or socio-economic status. When you look at the Ministry of Social Development, they say their objective, or the goal, to contribute to the improvement in the quality of life for citizens by making available land resources, housing, and facilitating mechanisms for sustainable community development. When you look at the Ministry of Youth and Sports, the goal, to provide opportunities for the advancement, empowerment, and development of our human resource in sports, and to empower our youth for life and nation building. You look at the Ministry of Health, the goal, to promote and provide health services that are appropriate, accessible, equitable, and sustainable by utilizing suitable qualified and motivated staff committed to excellence and professionalism. The Ministry of Agriculture, they have a goal a professional and highly motivated staff, providing efficient, effective, quality service to the agricultural community to stimulate maximum production for local consumption, export, and increase income through sustainable use of natural resources. So the point I'm making is all these different ministries in the public service of this goal, we need to get all these ministries together to work together in one plan with national objective. And that is what the National Sustainable Development Plan will do. Because we are working towards meeting these goals by 2030 and eradicating poverty. That's one of the biggest hindrances to our development. We have a situation of very high unemployment, especially among the young people. And therefore, unless we address this unemployment issue, we will continue to see the existence of poverty in different forms. And so, the aim of the government, the goal is to reduce unemployment, to provide opportunities, training opportunities for people to get them better qualified, to get them certified. And so emphasis has been placed on training and certifying our young people so that when the jobs become available, they can access the job. So while we work together as a small island state to implement all these policy objectives, we call on the international community to understand our own situation. I recall when Grenada was placed in middle income by the European Union, and they said to us we no longer would be able to get grant. We used to get grant support from the European Union under the 10th EDF. In the 11th EDF, I went to the meeting and was told, well, you qualify. So I said, well, we have high unemployment, we have high poverty. So, you know what was the response of the EU commissioner? We use one measure throughout the world. We take your population and we divide it by your GDP, and that's where you fall. So that's not our fault. So they're not prepared to consider anything else. You fall over the margin that puts you into middle income, and like the Bahamas put them in upper income because they divide the population by the GDP. That's how you get per capita GDP. So he said that's the only measure that they use, and that's where you fall. Now, we keep making the point that that cannot be the only measure. But we cannot be the only voice saying that. We need all the voices to say that you cannot use this measure to determine whether the country, the small island developing states with unique characteristics. I always say to the students of economics that each model is situational specific. You cannot just adopt a model. Given your own situation, you must determine the model that will work. So you cannot just copy a model because you have different characteristics, different variables that you have to consider. And so while we are all seeds, we are all different. But we have one common objective, to eradicate poverty. All of us have the same objective. As a government, and all government wants to lift the standard of the people. You want to provide better living conditions for your people. In fact, that is why you were elected. People elect you because they think that you will do a job in lifting them out of poverty or improving the standard of living. So we have the same common goal. So our approach is the consultative approach. As I said in the beginning, have the consultation, get all the sectors involved in developing your plans. You can, shortly you'll be able to read our National Sustainable Development Plan, because it will be online, to see what we have, what our goal, what are the economic, social, agricultural policies that we're going to introduce. And so at this forum, I am anxious to hear from other countries what they are doing so I can take it back to my country to improve on what we are doing. So I want to use this opportunity to encourage everyone to share your experience with us so that we can learn and have a better plan at the end of the day, and of course, able to achieve the goals that we have signed on to. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. Our next speaker is the Honorable Hazel Randy Williams, Minister of Social and Sustainable Development, Nevis. Honorable Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you, our distinguished chair, panelists, or distinguished panelists, colleagues. I would like to place on record my country's profound thanks and gratitude for us to be a part of this very timely symposium. I personally would like to also thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be on this very distinguished panel. And finally, I would like to thank the host country of the Bahamas for its usual warm hospitality. Colleagues, a pleasant good day to everyone. The 2030 UN Sustainable Development Agenda comes at a most opportune time when the countries of the world are confronted by a number of challenges, but also have before them the opening of new opportunities. What is critical about this new agenda is the way in which it seeks to define development in a modern 21st century society as a concept which is not one-dimensional, but rather is cross-cutting and encompasses economic, environmental, and social underpinnings. Permit me to say that this all-encompassing definition of development is a welcomed development for small island developing states. For it is well known that our economies are small, open, and vulnerable, but we are extremely prone to the ravages of climate change, and that we continue to contend with persistent pockets of poverty. However, if we are to tackle these challenges in a meaningful way and sustain our commitment to the 2030 SDGs and critical international documents such as the Samoa Pathway, then effective planning and policy conversions at the national level is important. I say this because the SDGs and the Samoa Pathway are but mere guiding documents. They only serve to lay the broader framework for these documents to have true meaning and worth. Effective systems of nationalization and localizing the principles which permeate them is key. To achieve this, our public institutions must be properly equipped with the right personnel, and the appropriate partnership must exist between the private and public sector in order to ensure that everyone is on the same page. What works and what doesn't work? We believe that the thrust of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda is one which emphasizes a people-centered approach. The SDGs must have relevance not just to the technocrats and politicians who iron out documents at conferences such as this one, but they must be driven at the level of the grassroots by the people who will benefit the most. Consequently, consistent consultation and communication with our citizenry at all levels is key. We ought not to implement policies for people unless those people for whom the policies are being implemented are afforded an opportunity to give their input. In St. Kitts Nevis, we have sought to have year-round formal and informal meetings with various stakeholder groups with reference to programs which are to be implemented. We host regular men's and women's forums which invite the participation of persons drawn from various subdivisions of society such as health, labor, education, and faith-based organizations to lend their insight on what are their pressing policy concerns, and we seek to integrate their views and sensitivities into our planning. As minister, in my bid to tackle youth unemployment and address the issues of entrepreneurship, I have implemented on what is called Youth on the Block meetings. And what I do is that I venture into the communities that are perceived to be the hotspots due to the strong presence of at-risk youth. And I engage them directly in their comfort zones to extract from them their ideas and interests, perhaps in a particular vocational field, and seek to marry government youth relief programs to their interests and needs. Furthermore, this year, our annual youth camp for children will be based on the SDGs, where each day for the 2-week duration, 2 weeks duration, they will learn of the significance of a different sustainable development goal. These interventions are deliberately designed to build partnership with civil society at the grassroots level and to ensure that young people in particular begin to take ownership of the process for achieving the SDGs. This breeds continuity and ensures that all the strain for implementation of the SDGs does not rest solely on the government, as other stakeholders and civil groups are educated and empowered to take a lead role. Challenges. One of the most critical areas for achieving the SDGs is the monitoring and evaluation framework, which will support SDG reporting. However, in the Caribbean, we have traditionally struggled with data collection. A critical theme for consideration must be how do we revise the monitoring and reporting framework at the age of the SDGs so as to ensure that many government departments, which often operate in isolation from each other, now have a greater degree of convergence in terms of information sharing. This, I believe, will be critical to the success of the SDG implementation. Our recommendation: a greater effort must also be made to build statistical capacity in small island developing states. This may entail all critical departments and ministries relating to the SDGs being equipped with some form of a statistical division or statistics personnel that collects data for the department and feeds it to the National Statistics Office. A greater effort must also be made to leverage the use of information and communication technology as a means of managing data, but we must be able to prioritize and organize it in an information management database, and furthermore, make it readily available and accessible to all people. This warrants better use of e-government strategies, especially in relation to critical sectors and departments, such as the Ministry of Health, the Legal Division, the Statistical Office, and the Labor Department. With the onset of the SDGs efforts must also be provided for government personnel to receive opportunities for education and training in the discipline of sustainable development policy. This includes opportunities for internships in other countries so that we can get an idea as to what persons are doing in their respective communities, respective countries, and this will promote information sharing and cross-country learning. A further recommendation is that one of the issues which must be placed on the front burner at the next high-level political forum is a commitment to delivering an increase in development cooperation resources, and that the developed countries of the world will take greater cognizance of the inherent constraints of SDGs. Of SIDS, sorry. The Prime Minister spoke very passionately this morning as to the challenges we face as small island development states, having to implement SIDS and at its inherent costs, as well as maintain our country's development, dealing with natural disasters. And so we are on the same path. My colleague here as well from Grenada has echoed the same sentiments. And as he rightly said, we are all small islands, and so we have the same inherent problems. And so throughout the course of this symposium, you will hear us more or less speaking from the same page, singing from the same hymnal. One issue for further discussion in the UN forum, further to this, is the desire to see the UN assess how it can lend greater technical expertise and other resource assistance to specifically build capacity in small island developing states. As we speak, my government is in the process of organizing a sub-regional forum on the SDGs for women and girls amongst OECS member states. We believe that it's important to do so, to bring the persons of the OECS together, as we are one in terms of being controlled by one central bank. We use the same currency. And so we would like to be on the same page moving forward. And so this symposium seeks to bind the countries of the OECS in. Thank you. OECS is the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. We share one common currency and we are governed by one central bank. Thank you, sir. And so what we are trying to do is that in the future, we as the OECS grouping can move as a block and we develop accordingly as a block. And so at this two-day session, we hope to raise awareness and examine how we can make the SDGs work for women and girls, and also to invite experienced personnel from overseas to offer mentorship and training in political leadership to our young females. Initiatives such as these are critical to achieving the Sustainable Development Agenda, And to that end, we make a special appeal for support of our efforts. And I would just want to reiterate that last line. And to that end, we make a special appeal for the support to our efforts. Mr. Chairman, I must say a very special thank you to you and your organization, United Nations Development of Economic and Social Affairs. I also say to my colleagues that though we may emanate from different lands, some from the Pacific, others from the Caribbean, some from America and Europe, we all have a vested interest in bringing to fruition the full-scale implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Let us therefore work hand in hand to build a more prosperous and peaceful planet for all our people. Thank you, and may it please you.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Our next speaker is Ambassador Alicia Faturi, Permanent Representative of Samoa to the United Nations. The ambassador was the driving force behind the Samoa Pathway, and he was the champion for partnership. Now, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Honorable ministers and distinguished panelists, delegates and representatives of small island developing states, their friends, supporters, and partners, ladies and gentlemen. As a Pacific Islander, it is always refreshing and personally rewarding to visit island nations of our AOSIS constituency, especially in the other sub-regions of our extended family, like the Caribbean and Ames. To the government and people of Bahamas, thank you for giving us a peek into your realities, your challenges, and also opportunities. I was particularly touched by the statement by the Honorable Prime Minister of Bahamas. It was a very inspiring, honest, and instructive statement. For me, if there is to be a lasting legacy of the Bahamas Symposium, and if we are really serious about helping small island developing states, then we must heed the Prime Minister's call and see how we can tackle the underlying issues that he has raised and challenge us to address. Hopefully, in the next few days, and if that is not feasible, at least at the first available opportunity, and make it sooner rather than later. Let me commence my remarks by making some reflections. The first UN Conference on Small Island Developing States was held in Barbados, in the Caribbean region, in 1994. The outcome document was the Barbados Program of Action, or BPOA for short. The second UN Conference on SIDS was held 11 years later in Mauritius in 2005, and the outcome document was known as the Mauritius Strategy for the Further Implementation of the Barbados Program of Action, or MSI for short. For the third UN Conference on SIDS, the Pacific region was given the honor to host it in 2014. In our many discussions with my Prime Minister in the lead up to the conference in Samoa, our focus, apart from the logistical requirements for hosting the conference, was on two equally important issues, namely an overarching theme for the conference and the name of the outcome document for the conference, especially as these global meetings only happens every 10 years. For the theme, we settled for the sustainable development of SIDS through genuine and durable partnerships, because it mirrored closely Samoa's own journey as a developing island nation and the quality of our partnerships harnessed through the highs and lows of our nationhood. For the name of the outcome document, we made the observation that only those in the UN following SIDS issues over the years, and maybe small island developing states themselves, who will know what BPOA, or Barbados Program of Action, and MSI, the Mauritius Strategy for Implementation, stand for, and are able to make the connection to SIDS, the outcome documents, and the host countries of those past conferences. Hence, the suggestion of using Samoa, both as an acronym for the outcome document and simultaneously to identify the host country. Hence, we had the SIDS Accelerated Modalities of Action, Samoa Pathway, which came into being in 2014 as an intergovernmental agreement that has the stamp of approval of the UN membership. Timing-wise, it was ideal. The SIDS blueprint of their sustainable development needs was already agreed to in 2014, while negotiations were still ongoing on other important intergovernmental processes like the SDGs, the financing for development, disaster risk reduction, the post-2015 development agenda, and the Paris Climate Change Agreement. The sequencing of these global events after the formal adoption of the Samoa Pathway meant SIDS needs and challenges can be integrated and captured in these agendas, frameworks, and agreements, which is very much the case now. SIDS felt very connected to the world like never before, and they hoped to seize the momentum from Samoa to lead their people and partners in a new direction. The adoption of the Samoa Pathway in 2014 and the 2030 Agenda a year later in 2015 presented a unique opportunity for Samoa to integrate them into its strategy for development, which was being developed and finalized at the time. And for good reason too, we had always maintained that while the Samoa Pathway, the 2030 Agenda, the SDG, and others are important global frameworks, unfortunately, they don't come with identified and dedicated streams of funding to help implement what they stand for. At the end of the day, it will only make sense to the very people that this agreement or understandings are supposed to help if we regionalize and localize them so that the people on the ground are able to relate and connect to them. So the strategy for the development of Samoa 2017-2020 was launched in the latter half of 2016. Its overarching theme is accelerating sustainable development and broadening opportunities for all. In the means zero forward by the means of finance, this is what he had to say, and I quote, "The strategy for the development of Samoa identifies the priority outcomes we think are right for the next 4 years and outlines the programs and actions we will implement to achieve those priority outcomes. We have aligned the direction of the strategy with the globally agreed sustainable development goals and Small Island Developing States Accelerated Modality of Action, Samoa Pathway, adopted in Samoa in 2014 by the Small Island Developing States Conference and supported by the United Nations," end of quote. Our sustainable development strategy has 4 priority areas of development and 14 key outcomes to be achieved for Samoa over the next 4 fiscal years. The priority areas are 1, economic, 2, social, 3, infrastructure, and 4, environment, which reflect the pillars of sustainable development. The adoption of the SDGs in 2015, while our national strategy was being developed, allowed us to use the sector-wide consultations to try and localize the global SDGs with our own strategy, to harmonize the definitions and concepts, as well as to advocate and raise awareness of the SDGs amongst all stakeholders at both community and national level. The result of our mapping exercise in terms of the proposed indicators of our development strategy against the SDGs and the Samoa Pathway, I will speak to it during the session on Thursday afternoon on monitoring, reporting, and building statistical capacities. Suffice it is to observe that we think there is a reasonable degree of alignment of the 17 SDGs with our national strategy and sector-level plans, and I will share with you now. The 4 priority areas and the 4 associated key outcomes and relevant SDGs includes priority area 1, economic. There are 5 key outcomes, and in terms of the SDGs that are aligned to this priority area, and the key outcomes includes SDG 1, 2, 8, 10, 12, and 17. For priority area 2, in the social, there are 3 key outcomes. And the SDGs that are aligned or linked to priority area 2 includes SDG 3, 4, 5, 16, and 17. Priority area 3, infrastructure, there are 4 key outcomes, and SDGs that are aligned to them includes SDG 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, and 17. And for the 4th priority area, which is environment, there are 2 key outcomes, and the SDGs that are aligned to it includes SDG 13, 14, 15, and 17. Now, from the mapping exercise, we found that each of the 17 SDGs were aligned with at least one of the 4 priority areas of our national strategy. The exceptions were SDG 8, which is promote, sustain, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Now, SDG 8 was aligned to 2 priority areas, economic and infrastructure. And SDG 17, which is to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnerships for sustainable development, was aligned to all 4 priority areas, economic, social, infrastructure, and environment. I think to some extent, this lends credibility and a vindication of the relevance of the overarching theme of the 3rd UN Conference on SIDS titled The Sustainable Development of SIDS through Genuine and Durable Partnerships. Genuine partners are those who will listen to your concerns, and if they have the resources and the time, they will support you. Durable partners are those who will be with you in the long run, no matter what. And that allows you to sometimes take a leap of faith and do things that you normally wouldn't be able to do on your own. Similarly, a review of development financing is work in progress in order to determine whether there are sectors that are underfunded. All sectors are encouraged to maximize synergies where they exist and be able to share resources and knowledge. Budgetary allocations, including development assistance through ODA and climate financing to sectors, are based on the premise that priority is to be accorded to those most vulnerable in all sectors. This ensures that no one is left behind. The implementation strategy for the Samoa Development Strategy is very much influenced by our commitment to a human rights-based approach which supports the conversion of such strategies with our policies, systems, and processes. Implementation is based on the different partnership arrangements for each sector. Some of these are drawn from the United Nations Partnership Framework developed for small island developing states that the chair of AOSIS referred to earlier this morning, and others developed bilaterally with our development partners and between government and non-state actors, and only recently through public-private partnerships with the endorsement of our public-private partnership framework. The partnerships will translate policy into action. They will enable different stakeholder groups and communities of practice working on the different priority areas of our national development strategy at sector level to share experiences and lessons learned, harmonize approach, support national monitoring and evaluation, and collaborate more closely in working towards the collective goal of building and supporting Samoa's journey towards sustainable development. The success of the partnerships is contingent on 5 factors, ensuring 1, simplicity and flexibility, 2, getting started soon, 3, the right one, 4, technical subcommittees, and 5th, the right resources, facilitation, and logistics. Getting started soon, the consultative process has been completed. The SDG has been launched and will be reviewed, and the reviews will be conducted annually together with the budgetary process. The right one. The partnerships will facilitate action. Reporting is annually at sector level and to Cabinet on implementation progress. The National SDG Task Force will coordinate the monitoring and evaluation process. technical subcommittees. Technical subcommittees of ministry, civil society, donors, private sector, and civil society can take forward specific technical areas of work, led as appropriate. This will be flexible and vary as the partnership so necessary. The right resources, facilitation, and logistics. The partnerships benefit from a governing institution such as the Sector Steering Committee and the appropriate resources to operate well. An independent facilitator for each steering committee can also assist with establishing effective practices. We have shared the same modalities of operations with the Pacific region through our membership on the Regional Task Force for realizing the SDGs at regional level. Now, briefly, in response to the 5 guiding questions, one critical lesson learned. For Samoa, the importance of contextualization of SDGs and localization of indicators through the use of sector-wide approach, including sector institutions and stakeholders for implementation. One challenge would you like to hear others experience? I think maybe for Samoa, it's the mapping of goals, indicators, and means of implementation, and making indicators relevant to the local population. 3, what would be one recommendation for SEEDS? I think the centrality of statistics to monitoring and reporting and translating ambition to action requires investment in human capacity. 4th, on political statement the high-level political forum could make, we would like to say that Agenda 2030 delivers for SEEDS, building on the Samoa pathway. And 5th, one issue for further discussion in UN forums. We would venture to suggest understanding the different ways that leave no one behind could be interpreted and manifested will make the implementing the SDGs more effective in practice. So let me conclude by stating the obvious. While every word in the SEEDS accelerated modalities of action, Samoa pathway are important, the critical ones are accelerated and action. And my call to SEEDS, our partners, and to the wider UN membership, as a follow-up to what the Honorable Prime Minister and other ministers and colleagues have said, let's accelerate the integration of the 2030 Agenda and the Samoa pathway into all the global processes, including our own national developments, and turn them into on-the-ground action as the only way to ensure that SEED's sustainable development needs for now and the future will be truly durable. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I still have 2 honorable speakers on the list, but we are approaching very fast to 1 p.m., the time allocated for me. So I understand this is not unfair, but I would like to ask the next 2 speakers to be as brief as possible. Our next speaker is Ms. Greg Farrimore, Executive Director, United Nations Office for Project Services. Madame Farrimore, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to compliment you, moderator, as well as the organizers for putting this panel together. 3 women, 3 men. Actually, a sustainable future is too important to leave to one gender only. And secondly, I have a question for you. How is your imagination today? Your ability to imagine? I see some blinking eyes. And thank you for those, because I think actually we need to put our imagination to work right now. And let me give you some examples why. You may have heard the new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, talk about his key priorities. One of them is prevention. With changing climate, we all know how adaptation is important for SIDS, but we also know how adaptation can be costly. Actually, I have a background as government minister too. And I've been in that position where I've been talking to myself and saying, if only we had prepared better, it could have been less costly, both regarding human lives and also costs to nature. So how can we turn this around? This is also what this agenda is about. Prevention is not only about conflict prevention, it is very much about development and how we work together. So let me give you some examples where we have been, as UNOPS, working with governments, also SIDS governments, in focusing prevention and focusing new ways of working together. And first, of course, to many small countries, capacity is a challenge. So how to ensure the right capacity to address both long-term planning as well as address crisis. UNOPS stands ready to work with you both on capacity building and actually how to think prevention in planning and reacting to crisis. It's a method. How can we actually encourage decision makers in doing the investments up front, rather than covering the increased costs afterwards? So it's the methods, it's the approach. And again, it's not always easy for politicians and decision makers to do those investments up front. It has to do with the method, the approach, the thinking, the imagination. And what tools do we need to be able to actually do what we think is right? We have tried to address all these things in projects together with governments in all parts of the world, but also in the SIDS. And I'm very happy to say that we have done some very good projects, and there is only one that I would mention because it's running now. It's with the government in Curaçao. We started only some months ago, and it will run for 2.5 years in actually planning for how to adapt the management of infrastructure in a way that will be resilient to the different changes that the country will face in the coming futures. It can be the effects of the climate change, to an economy that is less dependent on fossil fuels. Also, it is about improve the capacity of the Ministry of Traffic, Transport and Urban Planning in 2 capacities. It is industrial waste management and urban planning. It can be about procurement. How can we work together in a different manner to make sure that small countries don't lose out due to scale, due to lack of cooperation, actually finding these new innovative ways of working together. The last point I want to make is the run-up towards the Ocean Conference. Have you ever thought about how much of the pollution of the sea has been caused by land-based pollution? Can you imagine? 80% of which comes from the land-based sources. Actually, the litter, the marine pollution, 80% compromises, again, ocean health. So how do we work together on waste management? How do we work together on environmental restoration and improvement of urban surface water drainage? How do we work together on climate resilient water supply and management systems? How do we work together on potable water and sewage systems? Actually, all very important to clean the oceans, and all very important to citizens living in also small island development states. I really would like to address all these issues together with you, and we all are working hard towards the Oceans Conference and addressing the SDG number 14, but don't forget it's target number 1 that has to do with the onshore pollution running into the seas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Dr. Wokesa Kitui, Secretary General, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to repeat some of the very fine statements that have been made, and rather than go to the general themes, which are covered very, very efficiently and effectively, particularly in the presentation by His Excellency Elisaya Feturi. And thank you very much. You played an important role in the success of the Samoa meeting. I wanted to answer to what the moderator asked at the beginning. What are you doing? How are you contributing? In that vein, how are we relating with SEEDS in the specific areas of implementation of Agenda 2030? One, before I mention a few specifics, we at UNCTAD are consumed by this sense that the most important lesson we learned from the Millennium Development Goals was how did China succeed so spectacularly, more than anybody else. And our sense is that China defined economic empowerment as the most important enabler for social inclusion and social progress. And that's an important step forward in the design of SDG agenda is the ascent on means of implementation in goal number 17, technology, finance, trade, and other economic empowerment instruments. So one of the areas we think we can contribute to the realization in the seeds of Agenda 2030 is trying to address areas of building productive capacity necessary for structural transformation. And this we do on the basis of the unique identified national and regional priorities. At one area, we'll have smart specialization, like the work being done in Vanuatu on the National Green Export Review, unique biotrade products. We have helped to develop a national review and to strengthen the trading on this unique niche by the government of Vanuatu. We're also addressing issues of sustainable transport infrastructure. We talked earlier, we listened to a very passionate statement on the unique vulnerabilities to climate change, the cost of mitigation and resilience. And we are involved at UNCTAD in a specific assignment in the Caribbean right now, a UN Development Account project called Climate Change Impacts on Coastal Transport Infrastructure in the Caribbean. This seeks to enhance a clear understanding of transferable methodology for seeds transport policy and legislation. And we've done very, very useful preliminary work with the governments of Jamaica and St. Lucia. We hope that the results can scale up evidence-based dialogue about what's the best way to reform legislation and practice on transport. Similarly, we see the critical role of e-trade, electronic commerce, but not just electronic commerce as facilitating commerce, but how can we build in developmental content, strengthening market intelligence for vulnerable groups, strengthening capacity for inclusion, particularly sustainable job creation for younger persons. We have a global initiative we just launched last year, e-commerce for all, which has now gotten 22 of the largest corporate players in electronic development on board, in addition to 6 major donor or development partner countries willing to use this as a method to strengthen support in new thinking for developing countries. On fisheries, I'm not going into details because of time, but I've just uploaded on my Twitter account this morning a video I did last week on the road to Argentina, to MC11. So if you just check at UNCTAD Kitui, you will see my summary of the challenge. But importantly, we are working to raise collective awareness of the dangers of illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, and particularly fishing underpinned by subsidies. And the most vulnerable never subsidize their fisheries. It is those who least need subsidies that actually subsidize their fisheries at the expense of coastal fishing communities, and particularly on the small islands. At the larger level, we are working with the corporate sector on how do we develop new business models, from reforming business schools, so new thinking about sustainability and new definition of profits of the long term, to working with stock exchanges around the world on the Secretary General's initiative of sustainable stock exchanges, where equities are traded, but you have to declare their carbon footprint as part of the audit reporting. Similarly, we have been working with the transformation of global accounting and reporting standards to start taking stock of environmental and social degradation as part of the cost of enterprises when they're being assessed in their value. I want to wish, I would like to finish with a challenge of debt. Debt cannot be wished away as a challenge, particularly for small developing countries, in a number of ways. On average, seeds are more indebted, whether public or corporate, which eventually goes on public books anyway, than most other developing countries. And these cannot be privatized. The fact that close to 50% of fiscal resources of Jamaica are spent on debt service cannot be privatized. And the fact that we are anticipating the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates in the US and the attendant pressures of, on existing debt cannot be wished away. So part of sustainability is to address an inclusive mechanism through which early warning on stress and possible collective action to deal with unsustainable public debt becomes part of the discourse, instead of waiting for the crisis that we have seen in some Latin American countries. And this is particularly important for this part of the world. And finally, there was mention of the issue of graduation. My organization works a lot with countries graduating from LDC status. To our minds, the unique vulnerability of seeds requires a clear understanding that preferential market access should not be denied just on the basis of GDP per capita, as has been said so eloquently here. And this is an area where continuing discussion about UN recognition of a special category for seeds becomes part of the discourse about how to shelter them, shield them from the vagaries of graduating into the unknown. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I invite you to give them a well-deserved round of applause to all our distinguished speakers. We have overspent my time and your time. I'm conscious I'm standing between you and the lunch, so I'm not planning to do the summary of the discussions. I think the speakers, they made their points very strong and eloquently. However, I have to recognize one distinguished participant in the House. That's the Honorable Deputy Premier and the Minister of Natural Resources and Labour of the British Virgin Islands, His Honorable Mr. Patrick Pickering. Honorable Deputy Prime Minister, may I have the honor to invite you to say a few words, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, distinguished guests, honorable ministers, excellencies. The British Virgin Islands welcomes the opportunity to make a small intervention at this plenary, because we are pleased that the dialogue on CIS continues, particularly in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and the follow-up to the Samoa Pathway, which we participated in, representing the overseas countries and territories at that meeting. As a small island developing state, we would like to share with you the initial steps that the BVI government is taking to prepare for the implementation of the SDGs, as well as the work we are already undertaking that will support meeting the SDG targets. Just last week, the British Virgin Islands officials participated in a workshop in Jamaica for Caribbean states, which looked at integrating the SDGs into the national development plans and how the implementation of the goals are to be monitored and measured. We will be carefully considering the workshop's recommendations in our own national planning and seeking technical assistance from ECLAC. And we want to recognize the work that ECLAC continues to play, especially for the smaller developing states like ours. And we are very grateful for them having to include us as an associate member in the Regional Commission and Vice Chair of the Caribbean Development Coordination Committee, particularly after much effort was made to gain acknowledgement that all states require support due to their challenges despite their political status. I want to emphasize that point, that those of us who are not necessarily a part of the direct UN body still have development goals and special considerations. The Prime Minister this morning made specific reference to the unique challenges of small island developing states, and he outlined the Bahamian context. And so we are certainly found our UN partners to be responsive, and we are very grateful for inclusion, particularly at the regional levels. Now, while the SDGs are many, we will be placing a premium on the SDG 14, which will have the broadest impact on our society on account of the importance the sea and the ocean play in our economic and social development. As a tourism-based economy, we are focusing on the sustainability of the sector, which provides for the bulk of employment and our GDP. And thus, we are focusing on the management of our coastal and nearshore environment, conservation of our marine biodiversity, governance within our marine space. I take special notice of the last speaker mentioning fisheries development, which we are paying very specific attention to. And we are working diligently to ensure that we develop a sustainable fisheries industry within the context of the British Virgin Islands. In 2014, we commissioned a study on the value of the environment to our tourism industry, which we estimated to be worth about $200 million directly based on the environment. Our marine biodiversity and cruising waters are at the core of this value as our main attractions, so we cannot afford to see them degraded. We have just recently taken the next steps of commissioning a study on the value of the environment to the whole economy. And once completed, this study will provide us with the actual economic data we need to contribute to our SDG scoping exercise. We are also currently developing a national ocean policy with technical support from the Commonwealth Secretariat, which will provide a framework for the management of the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. We're very keen that any unregulated fishing activity in our deep seas is brought into a regulated framework. And we are also very focused on sustainable yachting initiative that we're working diligently to enhance, because yachting being a main part of our industry carries with it some very important negative environmental hazards. So strengthening of the standards will be necessary to ensure the health of our seas and our people. Nearer shore, we're undertaking a hydrographic study to map the seabed, which will give us an indication of where our most precious and sensitive marine biodiversity lies, so we can declare our new marine protected areas to conserve them. Understanding the true value of our environment is absolutely critical for the sustainable development of our country. Protection of our beaches and saltwater ponds is being strengthened and enhanced, and closely tied to this area are our efforts to adapt the effects of climate change. We are undertaking a costly effort to upgrade our drainage infrastructure to improve our resilience to stronger storms and heavier rainfall, a program that is coordinated under the OECS, funded by the EU. And we have also adopted a sustainable energy policy with a target of renewables making up to 33% of our energy mix over the next decade. IRENA support under the SIDS Lighthouse Initiative has been tremendously helpful in this regard, and the forthcoming EU support will also be helpful in these areas, although limited. And we take special note of the fact that many of the speakers this morning have spoke about partnership. And so we have many partners with whom we will continue to work on the sustainable development agenda. The Caribbean Challenge Initiative is a specific example of how we are working with partners in the region and beyond. So I hope this gives you a flavor of the progress we are making in our preparation to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to add here, Mr. Chairman, that the main requirement of the British Virgin Islands in this process is in the area of technical assistance to support our efforts. And so we ask that our international partners remain open to supporting associate members of the Regional Commission in this regard. Mr. Chairman, I'm duly thankful for allowing us this intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Before we adjourn and go to lunch, I just want to share some information with you. The Ocean Conference was mentioned several times during our discussions this morning. My department served as the Secretariat for Ocean Conference, which takes place in early June. I'm the Conference Secretary General. We have just finished two-day preparatory meeting last week. The enthusiasm from the floor has been fantastic. We have full house and full participation. Now we enter into the second phase of preparation, that is to draft zero draft of the negotiated document to be named as Call for Actions. So we hope that all participants as stakeholders or the government representatives will make your contributions, just bring forward your inputs for the preparation of the draft. Your efforts, your contributions will be greatly appreciated by us and by the member states and by the organizers. Thank you very much. With that, I would say we finished our session 1 and we are now ready for lunch. Thank you.
Just one housekeeping announcement. We will resume at 2:15 for the breakout sessions. Thank you.